In the early hours of April 1st, 1969, Fire Support Base Illingworth, nestled in the heart of the Vietnamese jungle, lay in ruins. For nearly 10 minutes, the once vibrant battlefield, shaken by a surprise attack, fell into an eerie silence following a devastating explosion. Now, hundreds of soldiers from both sides lay strewn across the ground, some slowly stirring awake, some not, every man bearing the marks of battle. Amidst this quiet, 19-year-old Specialist 4 Peter Lemon regained consciousness. Exhausted, scared, and marked by numerous shrapnel wounds across his head, neck, and limbs, Lemon's reality was sharpened by the chaos. He'd shared a joint with friends who were no more, an act that now intertwined his senses with a surreal clarity amid the devastation. Riddled with wounds and enveloped in a haze, Lemon was fueled by a surge of adrenaline and THC. Poised to challenge the odds once more, he reached for a bag of grenades and headed right toward the enemy. In early 1969, as thousands of foreign-born Americans fled back to their motherland to avoid the draft, Peter Charles Lemon, who immigrated to the U.S. at age 2 from Canada, willingly joined the army. Fueled by an unshakable belief in the cause, halting the tide of communism, Lemon was not just willing but determined to confront it head-on in the jungles of Vietnam. In the spring, Peter underwent basic combat training at Fort Knox. While life at the base was not easy at all due to the exhausting training and constant pressure, Peter Lemon thrived in every challenge, displaying incredible leadership and surprising his superiors. Very soon, Lemon was chosen to be a squad leader, and he and his team became one of the best in all of Fort Knox, with Peter leading as an example and pushing them to be the best version of themselves. As the top graduate of his class, Peter was sent to Fort Polk, Louisiana for advanced infantry training, where he perfected his technique. Ready to go into combat, in late July 1969, the now 19-year-old boarded a Boeing 707 and left America for South Vietnam. Upon setting foot in Vietnam, Peter Lemon's perspective began to shift profoundly. The complex realities of war, far from the ideals he held dear, challenged him and his comrades in unexpected ways. The harsh environment, coupled with the moral ambiguities faced by soldiers on the ground, blurred the lines between right and wrong, testing Lemon's convictions. To cope with their depression, Lemon and many of his friends found solace in marijuana, using it more and more until it was more than a daily habit. In late March 1970, Peter Lemon was a Specialist 4th Class in E Company, 2nd Battalion, 8th Cavalry, 1st Cavalry Division, part of the unit that established the Illingworth Fire Base in the Tay Ninh Province. Described by one soldier as a, quote, hot, miserable little place, Illingworth was a small fire base constructed in a dry pond, a mere 5 miles away from the Cambodian border. Its 219-yard perimeter consisted of claymore mines and a man-made protective dirt wall. Inside were about 215 men from several units who provided artillery support to units operating in that area. But it was so much more than just that. In the middle of the jungle, without a perimeter fence or barbed wire and with wildly exposed ammunition dumps, Illingworth Fire Base was ripe for an enemy attack, a bait for the North Vietnamese army. The base's vulnerability was irresistible. Air support was always at the ready, just in case. However, the communists were well aware of the trap, and knew that if they attacked the American base during the night, when aircraft were less likely to respond due to the increased danger, they would achieve better success. On the night of March 31st, 1970, Specialist Lemon and his 18-man squad were trudging back to Illingworth after a reconnaissance patrol in the vicinity, yearning for a moment of rest. Yet, just before the stroke of midnight, the base's ground surveillance radar detected stirring, a large enemy formation weaving through the jungle. Sensing the impending threat from the North Vietnamese, gearing up for a nocturnal assault, Base Commander Lieutenant Colonel Michael John Conrad acted swiftly, commanding his troops to unleash a volley of warning shots into the darkness. The message was clear. The Americans were vigilant, ready for whatever the night might bring. In response, Specialist Lemon and his squad roused from their makeshift beds and scrambled to their defensive positions, their hearts racing, ready to safeguard the base. The jungle, however, remained completely silent, as if holding its breath. With no immediate threat materializing, Lieutenant Colonel Conrad instructed everyone to try to sleep again. Back in the dimly lit quarters, sleeping was proving to be impossible. The men were acutely aware that danger loomed, yet they also knew the importance of preserving their strength for the battle ahead. In a moment of camaraderie, Lemon and his fellow soldiers shared a joint, reminiscing for a few minutes about when they would be able to fly back home, and then went back to bed. Resting on his flat pillow, as the clock neared 2 a.m., Peter felt the marijuana sharpen his senses, his mind alert amid the tranquility. But peace was short-lived. At precisely 2:17 a.m., the night erupted into chaos in Fire Base Illingworth. Within seconds, the once calm base turned into a nightmare as a 400-man force from the North Vietnamese Army's 272nd Regiment stormed the area. The communications antenna was the first casualty, quickly followed by a barrage of artillery and mortar fire. Outnumbered nearly 2-1, the 220 American soldiers in the base were on their own, as the air power advantage was negated by the dark, hot night. No matter how high they were, they would have to fight and win or be overrun. Unfortunately for the communist enemy, Specialist Peter Lemon worked better while completely stoned. Seconds after the artillery barrage lifted, the enemy came running and screaming out of the jungle, attacking in waves of up to 40 soldiers. Unknowingly, the enemy was concentrating its attacks at the southwest corner of the base, where the infantry defense was the strongest. In a hurried daze, as countless communists were swarming in and threatening to overwhelm the base, Specialist Lemon jumped out of his bunk and rushed toward his duty position to assist M60 machine gunner Lou Vaca, located at the berm. The thick dust caused their gun to jam constantly and obscured the angered, onrushing troops until they were barely 50 feet from the Americans. According to Lemon, the scene felt almost imaginary, like an action movie, with all the dust and flares only adding to his already altered state of mind. He would later confirm, quote, "It was the only time I ever went into combat stoned. You get really alert when you're stoned, because you have to be." When his mate's gun jammed amidst firing at the oncoming wave of men, Specialist Lemon took his M16 rifle and, in a rush of adrenaline, with all his senses more heightened than ever, unleashed his rifle's power with precision, taking down 5 NVA before it also malfunctioned. Discarding his rifle, Lemon picked up hand grenades and hurled them at the communists. Yet he ran out of grenades before he ran out of enemy soldiers. With only one soldier left in front of him, Lemon rolled up his sleeves and got to work on the last North Vietnamese troop with his bare hands in hand-to-hand combat. As he was about to knock him out, shortly after 3 in the morning, a titanic roaring explosion lifted both of them and everyone else in Fire Base Illingworth up from the ground. Only a day before, the base mistakenly received an erroneous delivery of 40 tons of 8-inch artillery shells. Being of no use to them, the Americans placed the ordnance in a neat pile right in the middle of the base. How the explosion happened will forever remain unknown, whether it was from one of the many small fires nearby, a deliberately thrown satchel charge, or one of the thousands of grenade and mortar rounds raining all over the base. The explosion created a giant mushroom cloud that made the soldiers wonder if an atomic blast had hit them. Some of those close to the blast were sucked into the sky, while everyone else was tossed through the air or knocked flat to the ground. Chaos ripped through all the men at Illingworth. Eardrums were blown, guns ripped away from hands, and dirt and dust flew everywhere, jamming every single weapon around the base. For minutes that seemed like an eternity, destruction rained from the sky. Falling shrapnel, equipment, and men caused a hurricane of confusion and pain. The resulting explosion left a massive 20-foot deep crater and a lull in the fighting for about 10 minutes, as Americans and North Vietnamese alike struggled to awaken or get up. When Lemon was finally able to stand, the young soldier was significantly wounded, dazed, and of course still stoned, but managed to stand up and drag one of his injured fellow comrades to an aid station. While running back into battle, he was wounded a second time by enemy fire. Neglecting his own pain, angrier and more stoned than ever, Lemon headed back to his position as the rain of shells resumed from both sides. It was payback time. As Specialist Lemon moved to his position in the midst of a hail of small arms and grenade fire, he realized that the defensive sector was about to be overrun by the enemy. For a minute, it seemed like all hope for survival was lost. He recalled, quote, "I said to myself, you're not going to make it through this one." With no time to lose, he grabbed a bag of grenades and put them to good use one by one until he ran out. When those were done, he began to knock out enemy soldiers, attacking one after another with his fists. While running toward the edge of the base, he got wounded again, this time by enemy bullets. But still in complete disregard of his wounds, Lemon continued to fight, knocking out enemies with his hands, and the unarmed, injured, and stoned soldier single-handedly kept the base from being overrun by the swarms of the North Vietnamese army. As some of the NVA soldiers were still attacking, Lemon, committed to protect the base at all costs, found an operable machine gun, jumped to the top of the dirt pile surrounding the base, and in a fully exposed position, the soldier continued to fire at the enemy, raining fire upon them until he collapsed from both his wounds and exhaustion. By 5 in the morning, less than 3 hours after the initial attack, the Battle of Illingworth Fire Base was over. Against all odds, and despite being outnumbered, the brave soldiers of the 8th Cavalry managed to repel the enemy. Lemon awoke in an aid station, and believing that others needed help more than he did, initially refused treatment or evacuation. Over the following month, as he recovered from his grave injuries, he pondered the aftermath of that night from his hospital bed. The Battle of Illingworth Fire Base was the worst single day of the war in 1970, with 25 American soldiers falling in action, including 10 from field artillery units. On the opposing side, 88 North Vietnamese Army lost their lives. When word arrived the following spring that President Richard Nixon was awarding him the Medal of Honor at the White House, Peter Lemon seriously considered turning down the award. Still, on June 15, 1971, 10 days after his 21st birthday, Nixon greeted Peter Lemon and proclaimed him a hero through the nation's highest honor. This would mark the first time a Canadian-born person received such a medal since World War II. For decades, Peter refused to carry his medal. Like most of his comrades, he was disappointed that those at Illingworth Fire Base were used as bait by top brass and kept his medal hidden in a shoebox. Years later, however, Lemon had a change of heart when he realized that on April 1, 1969, he'd fought for his friends, all of whom deserved to be mentioned and worn with pride. Ever since, Peter C. Lemon, the 8th youngest living Medal of Honor recipient, a sergeant who, high on marijuana, fought beyond the limits of ordinary men, started to carry the medal in memory of all the soldiers who defended the Illingworth Fire Base against the North Vietnamese Army.